Welcome everybody to our Hark and Silk seminar series, the very last in 2020 of our research seminar series. So we will be beginning again in 2021 with part 2 of The Edge, which is proving to be a very rich and fruitful research theme. But today we have Professor Donna Heddle, a very esteemed speaker with us. Donna is director of the award-winning UHI Institute for Northern Studies. Her research interests are Scottish and Northern Isles cultural history, Renaissance language and literature, and cultural tourism. She has led and is currently leading several national and international research and training projects involving cultural history and tourism, including a project in Vanuatu and Fiji. So I'm going to hand you over to Donna just now. And if you have any questions, can you put them in the chat box? And at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. Thank you so much. Donna, warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I hope you can all hear me. Now, a little housekeeping before I start. When I get excited, I tend to speed up. So if I'm going too fast, if some kind soul puts a message for me there in the chat, I will attempt to haul back the express train of my enthusiasm. And just a little background about the topic for today. A lot of my work is about people who are voiceless for one reason or another. And in many ways, people tried to make the Herring Girls voiceless, but they didn't succeed. I chose the title On the Knife Edge, particularly because they had sharp knives and sharp tongues, though not quite in the way that you might have been led to expect. Now, my interest in the Herring Girls really was brought to a head when I was fortunate enough to supervise Dr. Jill Dufresne, who did a fantastic thesis on this. And if you're interested in finding more out about the Herring Girls after this talk, I urge you to look at Jill's work, which I will be referring to throughout this. But without further ado, the Scots-Herring Girls then, well, who were they? What do I mean by Scots-Herring Girls? They were a large migratory workforce of women who were employed within the herring fishing industry, mainly during the 19th and 20th century. And what they did is they gutted and packed the fish in barrels as it was landed in the piers around the coast of Scotland and down in the southern ports of East Anglia. It was a huge industry. At the height of the industry, I'm going to share my presentation now. That's all, just before I forget, which would indeed never do. I can just find it. Where is it? Hold it, if you just bear with me, folks. Technology is obviously going well here. Oh, let's try this. See if I can find it. Oh yeah, it was open a moment ago, which is quite odd, but never mind. I will just go for a little bit of light badinage while I set this up, and away we go. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, excellent. So it was a huge industry, and I have here this very handy map, which tells us a little bit about the ports and so on that were involved in this. And this is, I must credit Jill for this. So at the height of the industry in 1913, the value of herring landed in Scotland alone was over £2 million, and it became the main catch of the Scottish fishing fleet. And at that time, there were estimated to be almost 14,000 women employed as gutters and packers. And during the months of May and June, the herring girls, the Scotch lassies, the fishing quines, the fish girls, the fishwives, whatever you want to call them, and that's interesting in itself. They're very much called by that group identity. And this is one of the issues that I'm going to explore later on, the difference between the individual and the group identity a little bit here. But they would travel as far north as Shetland to find employment in the bustling herring yards, and you can see Lerwick there, and there were other sites there, Lerwick at the top of the map there. And in late September, they would come home for a short while, because many of them would go down south, particularly to places like Lowestoft and Great Yarmouth, which you can see at the bottom right there. But you can see how many ports were actually involved in this. So the main curing stations of the period were found in Galston, Yarmouth, Lowestoft, Lerwick, Stronsay in Orkney, Wick, Peterhead, Fraserhead and Fraserburgh rather, Ardglass and Stornoway, and they were really big folks. There's a herring girl for you. This, for example, is Great Yarmouth. Absolutely colossal of boats there. And this is Ardglass. So a huge amount of activity, incredibly important. For example, in 1913, as Jill noted in her thesis, the fishery officer based in Stornoway reported that in May and June of that year, 2,400 women had left for the herring ports of Shetland and the east coast of Scotland, with 1,613 of them proceeding down to Yarmouth and Lowestoft. Why so many? Why did they need so many? Ask yourself. Well, because it was essential, particularly during the warm summer months, that the herring catches were cured in the salt and so on as soon as the boats arrived. So you needed a lot of women workers to do this. They had to. It was a fast and dirty job. They had to work very, very quickly to fill these barrels. So we needed quite a lot. And before the season started, the fish merchants and curers would send the employees out into the communities to contract the women, which was already unusual, and I'll come back to that. And some of them received payments which pledged the women to work for a particular employer once the season eventually got underway. The curers would then make arrangements for transporting their employees to wherever they were going. For example, in Stornoway, all the girls from all over the island would gather in Stornoway, sailing boats which would ferry them to their destinations, and quite often a nurse and a minister would be with them at the start of the season to provide care, both physical and spiritual, obviously, while they were away from home. Now, where they went to is very interesting. Quite often, some places they would be given lodgings in the town, like for example in Yarmouth. Sometimes it would be wooden huts, and the curers' lorries would carry the girls' possessions up to where they were going to stay. And these were very, very basic. Sometimes they had bunk beds in them. Sometimes they had mattresses, perhaps, and so on. But the girls brought their own bed linen and their crockery. They brought everything with them to make it as comfortable as possible. Typically, there would be a bath, maybe, and a fire, and basic facilities there, and possibly a stove to heat water and cook. It would be an outside toilet, of course. This is by no means luxury accommodation. And wherever possible, the girls would try to furnish this accommodation. And here's a picture of a typical kind of hut there. And I just want to look at the semiotics of this picture for a moment. This looks pretty normal, doesn't it? Normalizing of an uncomfortable situation. But if you look at the top of the picture, you see it is a wooden hut. Above where they've put the wallpaper up there, got the wallpaper, they've got a bit of oilcloth for their table, they've got pictures cut out of magazines and so on, and little knickknacks that they've brought with them. And I would also like to draw attention to the spotless nature of this lassie's pinny. So they were, very good at keeping themselves clean in these very difficult and primitive situations. But here we have a little bit of defiance, of putting a little bit of their own personality and of normalcy on a difficult living environment. And this is typical of the herring girls. And I will call them herring girls, although girls is a slightly pejorative term. But in fact, a lot of them did start going to the herring fishing when they were very young as 16 maybe or so. So you can see that they have defied what has been presented to them as a suitable place to live, and they have made it their own. So the main areas, where did they come from, these herring girls? They came from all over, really. The main areas that they came from were the Stornoway and surrounding areas in Lewis, in Barra and Shetland, and the coastal villages around the northeast coast of Scotland. Interestingly enough, we don't hear a lot about herring lads, but it's just indicate that there were men from Ireland who did come across. Sometimes it was almost unheard of for Scottish or English men to be herring gutters, of course. By 1914, this is a huge industry with about 35,500 people, as Jill Dufresne notes, employed in the herring curing industry, including curers, coopers, gutters, packers, labourers, carters and seamen, with approximately the 14,000 women working at the gutting. So why did they go? I mean, look, you're travelling all of this way. You're ending up in some ghastly wooden hut, probably hopping with vermin and goodness knows what. So why go? What was the point of going? Well, for many young girls, it was a very exciting adventure. You got to leave home, you got to travel. Um, it was a step away from home. You went in often as in a large group, which gave you a sense of safety and security as well. And there's an opportunity to travel. You could just go to one port, or you could maybe travel around like some of the girls did. They went all the way down to Lowestoft and so, and they'd see big towns and cities. And they were actually, there was a sense of community of the groups that went. I mean, some young girls, the mothers would only let them go if there was some older women who would take care of them as well. Now, travel had become easier in the 19th century. I'm not going to say it was that easy to come all the way from Stornoway or Shetland or anywhere. There were still huge distances to be travelled. For example, as Jill notes, the Barra women of North Bay, for example, at the beginning of the century would regularly walk 5 miles to gut fish in Castlebay and a further 5 miles home. It was a good fishing season and their labour was required. But of course, the railway was the huge benefit here. There were now railways linking Kyle or Ness and then on to Wick or to Aberdeen. There were also railways down to the East Anglian ports of Yarmouth and Lowestoft. And these had actually, they were built with the fishing industry in mind. It was only natural that the women who were working there used them on a regular basis to accommodate their seasonal migrations. One of the women from Shetland, interviewed by Anne Huntley from Walsa, which is also included in Jill's thesis, recalled being so sick on the boat and even on the train that she decided to never go back to Yarmouth. And the sea crossings do seem to have held some of the worst memories for the women, particularly the well-known crossing from Aberdeen and to Lerwick, which still today is not the most attractive journey. My own cousin did that and was praying for the boat to sink by the time he was finished, poor soul. But the crossing then, it was a very rough crossing. It often lasted for as much as 16 hours, which it still can today, actually. And the passengers actually slept on deck and they were often extremely unwell. It was very coarse, and as Bochel has noted, even experienced deep-sea sailors were affected by the rolling and tossing of their ships in the Pentland Firth and the dreaded Sombra roost, indeed. So let's just stop there for a minute and talk about something. The Herring Girls were the only women who travelled regularly in the 19th and 20th century in this fashion. At the time, it's highly unusual to see large groups of young women travelling on their own. And this in its own right is one of the prime markers that marked them out as a community apart, and othered them, if you like, because they were travelling on their own. And because they worked outdoors in the harbour, of course, they were seen, they were visible. So they travelled, they were seen, and they were essentially self-employed. Now, let's just talk about this for a moment and explain how extraordinary that was. For us today, that's not extraordinary, women travel, all that sort of thing. But really, what we're talking about here is a cult of domesticity. Women were supposed to stay within the home. I hesitate to use the term kinderkirche with its associations, but the children, church and kitchen, they're very much where women should be, and they shouldn't be seen, they shouldn't be travelling, they shouldn't be moving about. And this was actually quite a prevalent mode of thought for many centuries. It's only when you go back to a period of time like the Norse migrations, where women were so important in colonies, that you see women being able to readily travel and so on. So right away, the Herring Girls, by the mere fact of their movement, had othered themselves and had, if you like, crossed the line of society by doing that, by travelling on the road. Although they travelled in large groups, they were without male support and assistance. So, and they were highly visible as others, as things that were other from your normal setting in the towns where they came. And they were labelled, as I said before, the Herring Girls, the Herring Lassies, Quine, Herring Quines, Fish Girls, Fish Quines, Fish Wives, Scotch Girls, and Kipper Lasses. And of course, if you give somebody a label like that, you say Herring Girls, you don't have to say anything else. You don't have to find out any more about them. You don't have to see them as individuals. They're just en masse, in fact. They're creatures en masse. And it means that you don't have to reevaluate them. You don't have to take any perception or to consider different identities in that. And it gives them almost a mythological representation. The Herring Lassies, the immortals of Darius. It's the same kind of thing. These are not individuals. These are a thing. These are a force. These are a mass movement. Although the terms, are quite pejorative, I suppose, they do tell you about what the girls did. So they were Herring Girls, they were fishwives, there were quite a lot of them were indeed Scotch girls, not that we use the term Scotch for anything but alcohol and eggs. And sometimes Scotch eggs can be very important, as we know from political shenanigans last week, indeed. But they're certainly seen as something generic. And one of my favourite quotes about this, and I know Jill used it in her thesis as well, is Lillian Beckwith slightly. So I'm sharing it with you because it totally encapsulates the opinion of the Herring Girls, but it also encapsulates the opinion of the Herring Girls in places where people were involved in the herring industry. "So you're busy." It was Morag's voice, and I turned to greet her as she tacked across the croft towards me. Accompanying Morag was Flora, a remote kinswoman of hers who occasionally visited Bruach on holiday from the East Coast fishing port where she lived. Flora was famous in Bruach as being one of a band of kipper lassies, the girls who travelled from port to port throughout the herring season and in all weather sat out on the piers, deftly gutting and cleaning mountains of herring newly unloaded from the fishing boats, banding ribald pleasantries with the crews and reputedly screaming imprecations with complete impartiality at sluggard fish porters, scouting gulls, or indeed anyone who threatened to impede their work. Flora took great pride in being a kipper lassie and always carried around with her a photograph cut from a newspaper which showed her along with half a dozen other lassies smilingly busy at their gutting and seemingly oblivious of the hail and sleet that flew around them. There was an inked ring around Flora's photograph because the girls were so bundled up in clothes that identification might otherwise have been impossible. She was middle-aged, all beam and bust as Ertz described her, and her eyes and hair were appropriately kipper-coloured. Her voice was as strident as a ship's siren, her laughter piercing, and when irritated, her vocabulary would, according to admiring Hector, take the feathers off a hoodie crow. She was a good-natured, good-humoured soul, and whilst she was in Bruach, the summer ceilidhs were enlivened by lurid accounts of her adventures, quarrels, flirtations, and spending sprees. Accounts which I no doubt would have found more entertaining had I been able to decode more than one word in 6 of her broad East Coast speech, and that one word usually yawn. In her absence, the Bruachites referred to her as to all kipper lassies as Skin-a-Herring Lizzie, although they would never have been either discourteous or rash enough to have used the nickname in her hearing. Only once did I hear it used in her presence, and that was by Davy, a Glasgow-bred child without a vestige of Gaelic courtesy or reticence, who with his mother was visiting a relative in the village. One Friday evening, when there had been the usual batch of customers, adults and children, waiting at the weekly grocery van for their turn to be served, Davy was there, insolently superintending his doting mother's purchases to ensure she bought for him an ample supply of sweeties and biscuits. When Flora appeared, he had left his mother abruptly, sidled round to the front of the van and began chanting, Skin-a-Herring, 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 Lizzie. Now that's a lot. But the fact of them encapsulates this notion of them not being individuals, of them shouting and screaming, because women should be quiet. Don't forget that. Not only should you stay in the home, you should be quiet. You should not be heard. There shouldn't be laughing. There shouldn't be singing. There certainly shouldn't be speaking and creating a language, for example, that made you an elite community. There shouldn't be any of this. There's also the sense that there's the ribald pleasantries, that they were vulgar, for example, and I'll come back to this too. And I suppose if we look at this extract, we can take away from it, the Herring Girls are quite aggressive, quite immoral, they're smelly, because the kipper lassie motif, they're alien, and they're coarse. And I use the term coarse in the good Scots sense there. They're grouped together and they're described as a separate species, and in many ways quite a sexless mass unit at the same time, which is strange because they were considered to be immoral as well. And the alien quality of their discourse is supposed to be impenetrable. As in the extract, the writer says she couldn't understand every word that Flora was saying. Of course, this is a fictional extract, but it's a particularly effective one for the purpose. And of course, this reputed tendency to foul language, of which when we come to talk about some lexical items later, we'll see that this is just absolutely not the case. And although the skills and the speed of the girls were admired, many observers found it difficult to understand that bonny young lassies had to do such bloody work, as Simonton notes. In addition to this, it was not considered as appropriate for young women to travel and work independently, and concerns about their moral state were common, actually. But there's nothing new, I suppose, in seeing migrant workers in a negative light. So they're not alone in this, our herring lassies. they were accused of all sorts of things. They were accused of bad working practices, bringing unwelcome customs, and I would just look again at that nice clean lassie and her pinny there, and her making the best of and puts essentially a hovel there, so I can't see what the problem would be there of. Various interesting, so, but there's one particular characteristic, and I know Jill notes this in her thesis too, that's regarded as traditional and strongly present in the girl's life, namely religion. Nearly all of the people that are interviewed about the Herring Girls' experience refer to the scrupulous religious observance the girls from the Western Isles in particular followed. This is interesting because religion, religious tradition, beliefs and values are often considered as being something that gets in the way of progress. And it's true that the Scottish history nearly lost ground to the English at the beginning of the 20th century because of the strict Sabbath keeping of the Scots. On the other hand, you could argue that good or strong religions are very allied to capitalism, in fact. For example, if you look at the Free Church, the members of the Free Church considered obedience and industriousness as virtues, and the girls did their best to fulfill these requirements. And so in this sense, it's hardly hampering any economic development. And in point of fact, the Herring Girls provided quite a lot of economic benefit wherever they were. And shops would stay open late to accommodate them because they had long, hard working days. They worked from 6 o'clock in the morning right the way through, and then the shops would stay open at night that little bit longer, and they would be able to spend their very hard-earned money. Now, some of the locals did engage with the Herring Girls, and they did make attempts to improve their living conditions. And the church quite often carried out aid projects, and this was often stimulated, as I said, by moral concerns on the travelling girls' lifestyle. And it's an interesting thing, you know, that Jill created a new kind of visual sociology for the interviews that she did in her thesis. And one of the bits that I loved the best was the bits that weren't spoken, where you would ask so-and-so something about what they did in their spare time when they were away, and there would be a laugh and a look. But, you know, what happens in Lerwick stays in Lerwick, folks. So in Lerwick in 1913, for example, there was a sale held to raise funds for the furnishing of the new rest house, where, as the Shetland News says, the girls could read and write letters and get advice from the high-minded ladies in charge. Any which a rest house of this kind would help largely to remove. So that's the perceptions of the Herring Girls. But what was the reality of it? Were they really dirty, immoral, licentious creatures who were no better than they ought to be and should really be at home in their kitchen, or what? Well, any woman who engaged in the herring industry had to learn to travel. You know, the resentment that they experienced was by no means an isolated phenomenon. Migratory workers of any sort or gender at this time were stigmatized, as they were seen as very subversive to the locally based way of life and work practices. But of course, the fact that they were women compounded the felony, basically. And of course, the perceived absence of any male authority, which was directly counter to Victorian life, in point of fact. Any woman who got involved in the herring industry had to learn to travel, work and live independently. They had to become self-reliant, not only in their travel arrangements, but also in their housing and working practices. As I said, they tended to leave their home environment as a group together. And they made a conscious choice to do that. And the fact that they were in a group, although they're in a group, this kind of community, this kind of group ethos did help them and supported them as they were doing. As Nancy Dorian notes, the independence and comradeship of living away from home with friends and under their own cognizance brought a holiday feel to what was essentially hard work. And they enjoyed it. They looked forward to doing it. The efficiency of and skill of the girls was often much the gutting is something else. I did want to show a little bit of video of that, but I was rather worried about the technology. But if you get the chance, go onto YouTube and look at them. It's uncanny. But Margot Greco, who was the joint supervisor with me on Jill's PhD, noted that these women, quote, were from the public view to all intents and purposes self-employed, although defaulting on the Earl's deal would have incurred the repayment of transport costs, and these could be substantial. Either train, boat, having been involved in the herring stations, and accommodation costs without an immediate source of income with which to repay such debts, and not within the immediate control of their menfolk. The stereotyping of these girls as rough reimposes control upon them. It limits where they can go and who they can mix with. And that was also true. There was a nice anecdote of a girl who was dressed up in her Sunday best, a herring girl, and then there were people standing there looking down at the herring girls working and making a lot of rude and aggressive comments about them, and she didn't feel able to challenge that in any way, and she felt that she didn't want to be associated because she was in her Sunday best, which is a great shame, I suppose. And of course they did all dress the same. Here's a rather cheerful, I think, but showing that they're all wearing it. It's quite a late one. They're all wearing their aprons, but you can see that they were indeed all dressed the same with their head chief, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and their aprons. And you can see here the sense of camaraderie, which is why I chose the picture. I particularly like it. So the saying that they're rough and coarse isn't just othering them in a sense of saying they're different from us, they're migrant workers. It's also a way of controlling where they could go. You know, you're a herring girl, you can't come in here, you need to associate with your own kind, all that kind of thing. So it's a very effective actual mechanism of trying to make them voiceless, of trying to stop them engaging in society. But that didn't really work, because their speech was as sharp a weapon of resistance to social and cultural norms as their gutting knives, in point of fact. And the fact is that their own speech was actually extremely complex and sophisticated. Their lifestyle, the peripatetic lifestyle, brought them in contact with various, a variety of languages and dialects, which were far other than the speech communities that they came from. And what they did is that they established an exclusive work-related speech and a level of articulacy which they used confidently to get rid of this stereotype of being some kind of inarticulate subspecies, and to subvert established control mechanisms, making them feared as well as despised. So they used their sharp tongues to very great effect. But it was a very sophisticated language, in point of fact. And Derek Thompson, the Gaelic poet, notes this in his poem The Herring Girls in New Varsha Gaelic, written with apposite linguistic diversity in both English and Gaelic. And I quote, "But there was a sprinkling of pride on their hearts, keeping them sound, and their tongue's gutting knife would tear a strip from the lowlanders' mockery." However, the Herring Girls weren't just singing ritual defiance. There was far more underpinning their speech of work and play than simple day-to-day ritual. They created a community themselves, separate from the community that had othered them in the first instance. And it's when we look at this, we realise that the stereotyping that had limited them is subverted by them. They could have a good laugh at themselves. They could have a joke, and we have fragmentary evidence to say that they were quite good at parodying themselves, and they could take a joke. But they were supported, of course, by the own community they created. They gave a tongue to that community. They had independence of living from home with friends, the ability to do your own domestic arrangements, as discussed, as Nancy Doreen notes, it was like a working holiday. And of course, there were things like leisure time activities and so on, which was very important. We know that they would like to go to the pictures, they would go to the church, they would go to activities as much as possible. There's a quote here from Annie from Ness. When we came in, we used to wash and clean ourselves. We used to go out on our own, and if there were pictures, we'd go and see them. We used to go to prayer meeting on the afternoon of the Sabbath. A minister used to accompany us and spend 2 or 3 Sabbaths with us. So that was also very important. And the camaraderie, and this is a lovely story, and I think Jill's with us today, and she'll remember this. Lindy Henderson from Malik, who is she was very young. She was one of the last girls to go to the Herring Girls, the herring gutting. And she only went for a couple of seasons, I think. But she told a wonderful story, and she sang a song, a Gaelic song that she'd learned from the girls from Stornoway. She didn't know what it meant, but all those years later, she remembered it. And when she sang it, it conjured up that sense of community and warm, affectionate memories. Because despite everything, despite the way they were treated, despite the way they were spoken of, despite the way they had to live and so on, they certainly enjoyed themselves in so many ways. And it was really interesting when we were doing the research, Jill and I and Margaret, we went to Iceland to see the difference. It would see how the herring girls in Iceland were treated. And it was quite a revelation because, of course, the herring ports in Iceland were in towns that were created for the herring industry. Everybody in those places, like Siglufjordur in the north of Iceland, was part of that community. So there was no othering. There was no sense of othering. Where the Herring Girls lived, they lived in sort of bunk houses and things like that, but they were very much part of the community. Everybody's involved in the same industry. There is not this, and these places were specifically created for the herring industry. So there's no sense of othering there, and it's in sharp contrast to what the Scots-Herring Girls had to put up with, in point of fact. But it is very important to remember that they managed to, I suppose, overcome that. They overcome the cult of domesticity. They overcome the sense of being alienated and ostracized and living on the edge of society in a very real way by moving the locus of that society onto themselves, onto their activities, their pursuits, what they chose to do, and so on, what they chose to, the freedom that they had. Of course, they had their own money, imagine it. And of course, I'll just show you what sometimes they did with that money. I like this picture. It's from Great Yarmouth. It's from about 1911. And you can see that they've gone very heavy on the leg of mutton sleeves there, ladies, and they've all had their hair done. But it's rather a nice picture to show what the kind of things they were able to spend their money on, the choice that was open to them. So they changed the focus of society to the things that were interesting to them, the activities that were interesting to them. They took the power to themselves to organise their days and their living arrangements and how they spent their leisure time themselves, and they chose a voice for themselves. And without our tongues, we can't speak for ourselves. So that's one of the most important things. So now I'd like to move on and perhaps talk a little bit about that and about speech, and about the fact that they're always accused of shouting. Shout like a fishwife. Oh, you're shrieking like a fishwife. My own mother would have said that. You know, should have said that. Again, women don't make noise. You don't make noise. You stay in the home, you don't make noise. So the shouting here, of course, it was part of what they had to do. They're working in a job that's really fast. They have to keep a really high work rate. And if they have to shout at somebody to get moving along there, then they're going to do that. They're working in a team. They've got the fish has got to come in. They've got to gut it. They've got to get it packed in the barrels. They've got the layers of salt in. And sometimes they would take small children actually and hold them by their legs and get them to pack the bottom layers of the barrel as well. But that's a whole other class, I think, and possibly not reflecting well on child labour laws, but never mind. But they did this. And so they did have to shout, and they laughed. Again, they showed that they were enjoying themselves, and they sang too. They sang songs to one another all the time, and a very nice. And they moved. They had the freedom to use their voices and their bodies. They moved and they danced, and they went to ceilidhs and all sorts of things. I mean, and these freedoms that they had to shout and sing and all of these things weren't not part of normal working environments. When they did that, and see Margaret coming in there. Thank you, Margaret. See, they sang while they worked. They certainly did. I've got a nice quote that Jill Dufresne did an interview with Margaret Hughes from Anstruther and Fife. And Margaret said, you were just gutting them and throwing them, and there was tubs at your back, wooden tubs with handles, and they were all different selections. You had large, you had medium, and you're small, and you're standing gutting there, and you're throwing them to your back, and this would maybe have been lastrians, and then you would round your arm to another end, and round this, and round to another end, and this is how you carried on, and you were just doing this the whole time. And there was a lot of singing in that. And like you see the crofters doing the tweeds in that, so there was more singing than anything. And I'm from Fife too, so I hope Margaret thinks I did her accent justice there, or would think that. So this was a very different work environment from what was on offer to women in other industries as well. And of course, they had that power to go home to their communities at the end of the season and bring money, bring clothes, bring things people hadn't seen before, and the all-important present from Grimsby, of course. And Jill will remember well when she did the video recordings, how often people would have they'd have had their hair done, they would have a twin set on, they would have one of those display cabinets from the 1930s with a china ornaments with a present from Grimsby on it there, and they would have a photograph of the most recent grand. Was a whole semiotic and sociological awareness to the whole production, which was one of the really interesting things about Jill's thesis, in point of fact, and very significant. So they would come home with these things. They would come home with their, they'd gone off, they'd sailed off on their voyage, and they came home with a treasure trove. And they'd had adventure, and they'd had excitement, and they'd seen places, and maybe they'd had a bit of flirting too. There are babies who perhaps don't have a father on the birth certificate, but that was not the normal thing at all. This was a a very honest and joyous voyage that they went on. And I want to talk just a little bit to finish up. I'm conscious of time. To finish up on talking a little bit about the language, because the noise that they made, the singing, all of these things is incredibly important. How they were able to make themselves heard when their voice had been taken away from them. The voice of women in the 19th century is almost non-existent. The voice of women in earlier centuries is totally non-existent. It's absolutely astonishing to me, the fact how in medieval times we know all about kings, but we don't even get even queens, who would perhaps be the ones that you might think we know nothing about them, we hear nothing about them, we know nothing about who they were, much less the ordinary people. And that's one thing that I find particularly fascinating about language, is when it's language of ordinary people. And it's a social contract between people. It's a grouping of social awareness and so on that people are using to express themselves. And sometimes, the Herring Girls, having been associated with not being articulate, being vulgar, being incredibly rude, and all sorts of different things, and being a subspecies, it makes their language particularly interesting. So I'm going to just concentrate on that for a wee moment, if you will. It's one of my favourite things. So the lexical items that they use themselves hold cultural and historical significance. They're both sophisticated and cosmopolitan. And if you study some of the lexical items closely, you can see the patterning to the Herring Girls that gives, and their language also gives a historical context for the development of the herring industry. It should be noted, by the way, that there are no recorded instances of obscenities specific to the Herring Girls, which really refutes allegations of vulgarity. I'm sure they used quite a few fruity words on a. The lexical items are drawn from a variety of, I'm going to put up a slide so you can see some of the ones I'm talking about there. The lexical items are drawn from a variety of different language borrowings, registers and time periods. They range from the very early Old Norse words, like cran, for example, to through formal Old French, arl, there at the top, and colloquial Middle Dutch to Gaelic, and the kinds of words produced by modern culture, such as Klondiking, that you see at the bottom there. And this argues a linguistic sophistication entirely at odds with the hypothesis of inarticulacy. There's also words like farlin, which you can see there, which were brought into the work-related vocabulary and are unique to the herring industry, and in fact are of Shetland origin. Now, the antiquity and diverse sources of words such as arls, cog and roos highlight the venerability of the herring trade. I'll just bring it onto the next slide. So, yes, that comes from the Old Norse hrus, which is in the Oxford English Dictionary entirely due to me, a small claim to fame. But it was tossing the gutted herring very thoroughly in the salt to cure it before. So you're raffling it about a roost. It's like a whirlpool, and it's what you're doing is you're wheeling it all round in the salt and packing it there. Let's come back to my slide there. And of course, there's prevalence, distribution, and variance of words like mathieu, which is on the slide here, which refers to your young prime maiden herring. That's what it means. Mathieu is the Dutch word for maidens there. And it also underlines the major role the Dutch played in the development of the herring industry. So I just want to talk a little bit about these words. I'll just go back to the slide here for a moment and talk about that. Yeah. So arls then is the hiring fee paid to the gutters before the start of the season by the curing firms who employed them. It comes from the Old French arl, and Latin arula, which is a diminutive of ara in point of fact. And we find both the verb and in various forms, arl, arlis, and so on. We find that there's a Gaelic word for it, eilish, as well. Apologies for any mispronunciation there. But it's also found in Middle English, Modern English, and of course Gaelic. And then you come to cog. That's the small wooden tub for the herring gut. And like so many words that we have in our language, it's a practical word, and it comes from Old Norse keggy or keg. It's the same word as keg. And then we have cran. It's a measure by which herring were sold. It was a volume measurement of about 37 gallons, and fishermen reckoned it to be about 1,000 herrings. The fishery officer used a special barrel to check the cran measurement, and so a catch could be referred to as 20 cran or 20 barrels. The measure is now obsolete, of course. But this is actually a word that comes from Gaelic, comes from crown. There, a lot, a share, a measure of herring, and perhaps referring to the custom of dividing the catch by drawing lots. In 1772, Thomas Pennant, in his tour in Scotland, mentions the use of a barrel as a measure for herrings. And then we come into the old farlin there. It's the large wide trough into which the herring were emptied for gutting. It's a Shetland variant of foreshore, where fish were originally tipped. It ties into the concept of feudal law, actually, where the proprietors of owning part of the shore could charge for having fish tipped there. So that's why it started in Shetland there. Klondiking, of course, is a very modern one there. It referred to shoveling fresh herring into large boxes with ice and coarse salt and exporting as fresh herring to the continent. It was later used, of course, for the factory ships, the Klondikers, and of course it comes from the Gold Rush place name in Alaska. And then we have our machi, or our matties. Now this is incredibly prevalent. We have the first indication of this, we have it in Scots in 1721, and it also comes in Alan Ramsay's poems. Dare she nane or herring seller previa for she says, dear macho, which your leave there. So, and basically, as soon as the herrings were caught, they were immediately gutted and distinguished by three different species: the matty herring, which is the smallest kind; the full herring, the large milk; and the spent herring that's lost its roe, which was considered to be the poorest sort. So, the large matty herring, lightly salted, tended at the beginning of the season tended to go to America. The later, richer, heavily salted ones went to continental and home markets. So, and then nets here is the name given to the ringnet boats when they first come from the west coast in the 20s. Drift netmen really disliked navies. They considered that it would sweep the herring grounds clear of even immature fish, and it comes from Old Norse nabi, point of fact. Now we come to nepian, which is a small head shawl to protect the hair. And this was actually a big feature with the Icelandic herring girls. This was something they shared in common. And this, of course, comes from the late Middle English and early Middle English napkin or napkin. Napkin is a word that we recognise. And napa and nape also meaning a cloth. But it has a specific usage meaning a handkerchief or a neckerchief or a headchief. And P. Smith in Fisherfolk in 1952 notes, then tartan nepians held this way or head. And Edwin Muir's autobiography, 1954, notes, she always wore a napkin round her head, tied so as to form a little penthouse over her brow. And then Roos, of course, I was mentioning about tossing the gutted herring very thoroughly in salt there, and coming from Rosta. And then scran, which you may have heard in other senses, used for a boy's activity during the herring seasons. They would scrounge round the piers and the boats, and then they would pick up odd herrings to sell for a few coppers. Indeed. So, sorry, I'm having a fankle there. I'll just come out of the presentation if I can. Hopefully you can still see this. So, having had a slight down looking at the language and looking at the complexity and the cosmopolitan nature of the language that we're using, which was also providing a barrier between them and those that would other them in the first instance, we can come to a conclusion. We can see that herring girls were cosmopolitan, articulate, moral in the main, and socially organised. They had a work-specific vocabulary of some sophistication. Their vocabulary shows range, history, and cultural significance. Their speech was a sociolinguistic determiner, which, along with apparel, was their prime cultural marker, not the language of the gutters, but the gutters' language. Thank you. I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Donna. So interesting. That was absolutely wonderful talk, and I love the language discussion that you brought to us, and so much to think about. It was such a rich talk, and there are lots of questions here. Kate asked, I wonder in what ways the reception to the herring girls in different ports might have differed from the reception to the incoming fishers. For example, the Dutch, the Scotty fishers from Peterhead, the Klondikers in Shetland, and so on.
Well, that's a very good question, Kate. Thank you. And of course, migrant workers coming from anywhere are viewed with grave suspicion. But of course, the herring girls had the added, terrible trouble of being your actual woman as well. as being a travel. So there was that layer of misogyny as well, I'm afraid, that they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be there. They should be at home cooking their man's tea, which unfortunately is still quite a prevalent mode of thought for some people. So it would have been different, and there would have been that layer of misogyny as well. But everybody would have been regarded with the gravest suspicion at all times because they were fey af or from elsewhere.
Yes, Kate is kind of expanding that question a little bit, asking about the fact that like the fisher wives were almost like living between the sea and the shore, and the fishers, the fishermen were associated with the heroics of the sea.
That's very true. The fisher, as often women find themselves in a liminal landscape. Neither fish nor good red meat in so many ways, and that would be very true for them too. That's a good point there, Kate.
And Katrina offers the point about attitudes to flirting and to the male-female relations. She's saying that they were rather different in this is more of an observation really, that they were rather different in Shetland from the strictly religious girls from the Western Isles.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed, that's very true. As I said, what happens in Lerwick stays in Lerwick.
And Margaret Stewart is asking about, you mentioned about the shouting like a fishwife, and she is reflecting on that and asking, is that not the fishwife? It was that little phrase not associated with the fishwife who sold fish on the streets rather than the gutters?
Well, it was associated with them both, actually, but Margaret's quite right there. I mean, when I think of that, I'm thinking about the fishwives of Newhaven, for example, with their striped skirts and their baskets. So that's certainly, but the noise, the shouting was certainly associated with them both. But Margaret's quite right. Who'll buy my caller herring? They're bonny fish and halesome faring. Who'll buy my caller herring? Fresh drawn frae the Forth. Absolutely.
And Myrid is asking an interesting question about, is there much written on the girls that came from Ireland?
That's a very good question, actually, Myrid, and my honest answer to that is I'm not entirely sure, but I can certainly find out for you. I'm much more sort of researching on the side of language, you see. I don't know, but I will attempt to find out for you, Myrid.
And Neil MacLeod is asking, was there any, you were talking about the song and the music, was there any connection between the songs from the Walking the Tweed to the songs while gutting?
Oh, that's very interesting. I don't know if you maybe heard in that quote that I did from Jill's interview with Margaret Hughes, she talks about the folk that worked at the Tweed, the songs. She actually refers that. So there's a sense of the singing helping work. It's dirty, hard work. Your hands are cutting knife strapped with cord and things like that. It's not a laugh, Lindsay, basically. Sure. So songs would keep them going and cheery and positive. So yes, I think there was very much a sense of the songs valorising the work and helping with the drudgery.
Did they end up with like claw-like hands with their hands?
Well, some of them, I mean, they're out there in all weathers, basically. Some of them certainly came back with arthritis and things like that. So it was not an easy job, but they felt that the benefits outweighed the demerits.
Lauren Hossack is asking about the role of children in gutting, which you touched upon.
Well, yes. I mean, they were very, of course, they were small, so they could be lowered into the barrel, because, of course, the main thing is to get your barrel packed as tightly as possible to keep the fish preserved, and also, to make sure it arrived in good condition. So, yes, children were used for that kind of thing, but they weren't a huge part of the workforce.
Mm-hmm. And here's some recent questions here from Anna Freitas saying, my granny did tell me that if they were asked how to say good morning in Gaelic, they would teach them to say,
Pog Mahone, perhaps. Yes.
Ah, yes, it is Pog Mahone.
That's kiss my bottom, Lindsay.
Yes. Actually, when you said it, I immediately recognized it. So it's not
Yes,
completely
well,
innocent.
that's still happens today. Thank you very much, Gaelic speakers, and others. Oh yes, they would be having a bit of a laugh there, indeed. Thanks, Anna, for reminding me of that. That's a good example. It just shows you the humour. I've referred briefly to their sense of humour and so forth. They were joyous souls in the main. You can see that from the pictures. There's cheeriness there and positivity, and that's just a somewhat naughty example of it.
Yep. There's somebody here called Lorraine Sharp who is saying that she has a long-standing wish to do a PhD on herring. So,
hello, Lorraine. Yes, well, certainly UHI across the board could provide you with an excellent supervisory team. And Jill's PhD thesis is absolutely excellent. It was a fascinating piece of work, but there's still plenty of work to be done. Of course, they're women, you see, so women's work is sometimes not regarded in quite the same way as men. I know the Women's History Network and so on do fabulous work, and Lynn Abrams and other colleagues working away in this area. But yes, there's plenty to be done yet. So plenty of research opportunities there. There's lots I would like to do myself, but I have quite diverse research interests, and sometimes I might be working on Vikings, or I might be working on aviation in the Northern Isles, or the Lord knows what, although I am technically a medievalist. There you go.
There's another interesting wee comment there from Katrina saying that newspapers in Northumberland complained about the lasses going off to follow the fishing and leaving the lads at home bereft of the young women folk.
Oh, that's delightful, isn't it? That certainly puts the cult of domesticity in its place, doesn't it? That's great. I'll have to look for that. Thanks very much. But that's it. You see, it gave them, this was also alarming because they were behaving like men. They're behaving like men. They're traveling, they've got their own money, they're making their own arrangements. Oh, yes, we cannot be having that. Thanks, Katrina. There's a question that's just popped up that she'll send me the quote. That's great. We really, I wish I'd known that before this talk. That would have been fabulous to put in.
And there's Mandy asking about all the fiction around. She's asking if enough has been done. Has the justice been done to the fisherwives in a fictive sense?
Well, Mandy, that could be a nice job for you, I think, actually. Not really, no. They tend to appear in that very... I mean, there's a wonderful play. There's the play about the herring lassies, for example, which is a very moving play. So they've probably been done better justice in the theatre than in the novel, actually. But, there you go, Mandy. There's your next subject.
Oh, and a question from Rosie asking, was there a difference in their leisure activities at home? Then I presume she's meaning them when they were away at work.
Oh, yes, absolutely. No picture houses in Norway or any place like that, or Lerwick to speak of. So it would have been, it would have been the big shops. Now, as a lassie from a small place myself, I quite fancy a big shop now and again. And so there would have been, there would have been different things to go to. They would have gone on, in some of these places like Great Yarmouth and so on, which had a promenade or an esplanade. They would have gone for walks there, not necessarily a feature of where they... When they were at home, they would do very different things. There would be ceilidhs and things like that at home, and they would be, of course, the strong religious. I did mention about the Western Isles lassies, but certainly the East Coast villages, the fishing folk community, have very strong religious beliefs. Understandably, when you're giving yourself to an uncertain element on a daily basis, so they would have had revivalists sing-alongs, and Sankey's hymns were incredibly popular. That's the kind of thing they would have been listening to at home. But down in the exotic South, or exotic Lerwick, in fact, there would be other opportunities available to them. And of course, they would have bought themselves the last picture there with the beautiful dresses. They would have been on promenade to do that. That wouldn't have been, I suppose they would have worn that dress to church, maybe not. Yeah. So there would have been a difference indeed, yeah.
One last question, I think. Did it all finish during World War One?
No, obviously, but bear in mind that World War One is a very different kind of war from World War Two. World War One is a war that's fought very much on a battlefield in trenches. There is a naval element to that, of course, Battle of Jutland and so on and so forth. My great uncle went down with a ship age 16 at Jutland, but it was not the same kind of war as World War II, where you have much more warfare in the water. And obviously the people needed to be fed, but it was curtailed slightly, but people did need to be fed. So it was a different way of doing, but it still went on.
Yeah. Well, I think
I see Lorraine Sharp there's made an excellent point about Stronsay. This is what's so fabulous. Not only does Stronsay have the only bit of railway in Orkney, as Lorraine points out there, it had a vast array of businesses during the herring. It had several ice cream parlours, a Boots the Chemist, and the biggest bar in Britain when the herring fleet was in. It was 100 foot long.
wow.
Mm-hmm.
Oh
So you see,
my
it's a different way of looking at things. I was going to put a bit about Stronsay in this, but I didn't think I had time, in fact.
I think you have given us so much, and it's a really jolly, lovely thought before Christmas about these wonderful women and all the stories you've told us. And thank you very much, Donna. That was so entertaining, really. And there's lots and lots of messages here coming up.
How kind. Thank you very much for asking me. I have enjoyed it. I'm afraid I've been rather full of the cold, so I'm not firing on all cylinders today, but I certainly enjoyed speaking to everybody. It was lovely to see all the comments and the questions. Thank you.
Yes, lots of lovely questions. And I'm just going to make one announcement before everyone goes away, and that is our first seminar of 2021, Thursday, the 28th of January, 1 o'clock, Arts on the Edge, socially engaged, sorry, I keep losing as more chat comes in, socially engaged practice in rural and island communities. And that's led by some MA Art and Social Practice students from UHI. It's a little bit of a panel thing. And of course, the full details will be available on our website. So thank you everybody for coming along, and a huge thank you to Donna. That was a really, really fabulous pre-Christmas treat. Thank you.